Michael Vick, Cam Newton, Lamar Jackson, and Josh Allen, along with so many other QBs, have been talented enough to win, but if you look at their total combined Super Bowl rings, it's 0. These are some of the most physically gifted quarterbacks in the history of the NFL, yet none of them have ever hoisted the Lombardi trophy. The thing is, this wasn't just a coincidence or a string of bad luck. Their athleticism was actually their greatest weakness because it taught them to rely on their legs when they should have been relying on their arm early on. Think about what it actually means to be a freak quarterback at 10 years old. You're bigger and faster than everybody else to start off with, and so you can extend plays and run them in for touchdowns while everybody else is still trying to figure out how to actually understand a play call. Now here's the problem with that. When you can solve every single problem by running, you never develop the tools to solve a problem by staying still. The tape doesn't lie about pocket passing. It isn't a natural skill, but rather a skill built through constant failure. You have to stand in that pocket and feel the pressure closing in on you while you go through your reads and trust your timing. Every instinct in your body is screaming at you to get out, but you stay where you are because you have no other option. When you can't run your way out of trouble, you're forced to throw your way out. And that's exactly where footwork gets refined. That's where your pre-snap reads become automatic and the timing on a crossing route becomes second nature because it simply had to. Freak athletes never hit that wall growing up, so they never bothered to build those tools. Here's a version of this exact problem in basketball that we see with Giannis Antetokounmpo and Ben Simmons. Both of them entered the NBA as physical freaks who could dominate entire games without ever shooting from the outside. Why would you develop a pull-up jumper when you can just go straight to the rim and do whatever you want? Because they relied on that, they got to the pros with a massive hole in their game that elite defenses exploited immediately. And it's the same logic in football. When the NFL decides to take away your legs, you have to be able to beat them from the pocket. There's another layer to this that doesn't get talked about enough because coaches at every level prioritize winning over development. If you're the fastest kid on the field in 7th grade, your youth coach is gonna run you on every single sweep play because they want to win on Saturday. Your high school coach builds his whole offense around your legs to keep his job, and your college coordinator draws up zone reads all week to give him the best shot at victory. Nobody ever stops and says they should spend 6 months working on your footwork in the pocket even if it costs them a few games. That never happens because winning matters too much at every level for anyone to slow down and fix what doesn't look broken yet. The freak athlete arrives in the NFL having never been forced to develop the boring parts of the position, and then they hit that NFL wall. Defensive coordinators spend all week scheming to take the legs away and shrink the field, which forces these quarterbacks into situations they genuinely have never had to solve before. And that's exactly where everything falls apart. This isn't a modern problem because it goes back decades. Fran Tarkenton is probably the original copy of the actual scrambling QB, and he was scrambling before it was even really a term in the NFL. He spent his career buying time behind the line and making defenders look completely lost while turning broken plays into first downs in ways nobody had ever seen before. He took the Vikings to 3 Super Bowls but lost all 3 of them. By the time he was playing in the championship games, defenses had watched enough film to know exactly what Tarkenton was going to do when the pocket collapsed. They contained the edges and kept him inside, and when he had to stand there and beat them through the air in the moments that mattered the most, the results just weren't what they needed to be. He was a Hall of Famer for sure, but he simply couldn't win when it mattered the most. Randall Cunningham is where the conversations get more uncomfortable because he was genuinely something different. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler and the most physically gifted quarterback his era had ever seen by a clear margin. He could run past defensive backs or throw the ball 70 yards off his back foot, and the Eagles' teams around him were legitimate contenders talented enough to make a real run. But Cunningham's instincts in big moments was always to create and improvise while betting on his own physical ability to solve the problem. Elite playoff defenses are built specifically to take that bet away from you, and when they did, Philadelphia kept going home early. Michael Vick being my all-time favorite player hurts to have him here. He's a ceiling for what pure athleticism looks like at the quarterback position. He was the fastest player ever measured at that spot and became the first quarterback in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards in a season. He was so fast that defensive coordinators genuinely didn't know what to do with him on a week-to-week basis. However, his completion percentage sat around 56% for most of his career because he never had to develop the kind of touch and timing that comes from standing in the pocket and working your way through progressions. He said himself he didn't take the fundamentals seriously early enough in his career. Why throw a 12-yard crossing route on time when you can outrun the entire defense for 40 yards? The problem is that in January, you can't. Then you get to the short career guys who show the same arc in a compressed timeline. RG3 came into the league as a legitimate phenomenon who won Offensive Rookie of the Year and made Washington relevant in ways it hadn't been in years. Defenses adjusted by year 2, and after his knee injury, he couldn't adapt fast enough, so his career was essentially over before it began. Colin Kaepernick took the 49ers to a Super Bowl on the strength of his legs and his arms and an elite defense. But when defensive coordinators solved the read option scheme the following season, his limitations in pure pocket situations became impossible to hide. Justin Fields and Anthony Richardson are the most recent versions of this. They're electric athletes with burst and the kind of improbability that makes highlight reels every single week. Anthony Richardson can miss the easiest hitch route you ever seen and then throw the best ball of all time in the exact same game. But timing routes from the pocket, holding the ball at the right moments, and processing pressure to deliver on schedule are skills that are built through repetition under the right system. Fields and Anthony never got that at the NFL level, and while the athleticism was insane, the pocket efficiency never came. The pattern doesn't discriminate by era, and it just keeps repeating itself. Cam Newton's the most physically imposing QB the NFL has ever put on a field. He wasn't the best athlete based off pure speed, but he was the complete package, size and mobility, and the throw power to actually get the ball 70 yards down the field. He was just insane. He stood at 6'5" and weighed 245 pounds while running a 4.59 40, and he threw 35 touchdowns in his MVP season. He was simultaneously the biggest guy on the field, one of the fastest, and defensive coordinators had no answer for what that combination looked like in the open field. His 2015 season is as close as any player on this list to ever get to the top. The Panthers won 15-1 and he won the MVP by a landslide before they made the Super Bowl. If you watch that entire run, you genuinely believe this was the year a pure freak athlete was finally going to break through. Then the Denver Broncos showed up with Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, and the no-fly zone defense with one simple game plan. We're not letting him lead the pocket. They kept contained on the edges all night and forced Cam to stand in and deliver against the best pass rush in football. When he had to do that drive after drive, the offense that looked unstoppable all season went completely silent and Carolina only scored 10 points. The fumble in the fourth quarter became the moment everybody remembers, but it's really a symbol of something that was already happening. When defenses forced Cam to win from the pocket rather than with his body, his efficiency dropped significantly. That was true throughout 2015, even during the winning streak, but the Broncos just did it better than anyone else had all season. What happened after the Super Bowl tells you everything you need to know. Cam's numbers never returned to that level, and while shoulder injuries accelerated the decline for sure, the structural limitation was already there. Once defenses had the blueprint for containing his legs and forcing him through his reads under pressure, the results were different. The physical gifts that made him the MVP weren't enough to compensate for the pocket processing the position demands at its highest level. Tim Tebow is almost the opposite story. Where Cam was a generational physical talent who came close, Tebow was a player whose will and athleticism kept him on the field far longer than his throwing mechanics should have allowed. He had a 48% completion percentage rounding up, and defenses figured out his limitations faster than almost anybody else in recent memory. His career as a starting quarterback was essentially over after 2 seasons when he was only 25 years old. But here's what Tebow actually proves. He won games in the NFL and even beat playoff teams on pure determination and physical toughness with the threat of what he could do with his legs. He kept drives alive that had absolutely no business surviving. The moment defenses had enough tape to commit to taking that away from him, the passing game couldn't sustain anything. There was nothing behind the athleticism to fall back on, and both players show you the same ceiling from different angles. You can carry a team to the doorstep on sheer physical force, but getting through the door is something else entirely. Let's talk about my favorite current player in Lamar Jackson, because his regular season resume is one of the most dominant things we've ever seen, but his playoff resume, unfortunately, is one of the worst. He has 2 MVPs and over 6,000 rushing yards to his name, which is just video game stuff. Back in 2019, he threw 36 touchdowns against only 6 interceptions while rushing for over 1,200 yards, and that performance broke the all-time single-season rushing for his position, all while those 36 passing TDs led the league and he won a unanimous MVP. During that stretch, the Ravens' offense didn't even look like an NFL team, and it felt more like a cheat code that the developers forgot to patch. Nobody had an answer for him at all, and you even had defensive coordinators going on the radio admitting they had no clue how to stop what Baltimore was doing. But then January came. The playoff loss to the Tennessee Titans is where this whole conversation started, and we need to sit with that game for a second to understand why. The Titans didn't actually beat Lamar Jackson because they had better players or more talent on the field. They beat him with a specific scheme that built entirely around containing his legs and forcing him to stand in the pocket to sustain long drives with his arm. They kept their contains all night long and refused to gamble for splash plays, basically telling Lamar he had to beat them from the pocket for 60 minutes straight. He ended up with multiple turnovers that game, and an offense that looked unstoppable for 4 months couldn't string anything together once the plan removed the one weapon their entire identity relied on. That wasn't just a fluke, it was a blueprint for the rest of the league. Kansas City has used a version of that same blueprint against Baltimore over and over since then. And the 2023 AFC Championship game is the clearest example we have. Off the back of another MVP season from Lamar and much improved accuracy, the Chiefs came into Baltimore. This time though, it felt different in that maybe this was Lamar's year. But the Chiefs went into halftime with a lead and spent the entire second half making Jackson beat them through the air in most obvious passing situations. They took away the running lanes with disciplined front seven play and just waited for the mistakes to happen, which caused the Ravens offense to stall out completely. It's not that Lamar isn't talented enough to throw the ball, because he's improved dramatically in that aspect. But winning from the pocket in January against a Patrick Mahomes team on the biggest night of your career requires a specific processing speed. You have to have done it hundreds of times before, when there was no other option. But Lamar was never forced to do that because his legs were always there to bail him out. His career playoff record currently sits at 3-5, and his completion percentage in those losses drops off a cliff compared to his regular season numbers. His turnovers also spike in the games that matter the most, and these aren't just close calls where the Ravens lost on the last second kick while Lamar played great. In these losses, the offense actually went backwards in the most critical moments because the defense forced them into sustained pocket passing that he couldn't maintain for 4 quarters. His last playoff game against the Bills wasn't all his fault for the loss. After an awful first half, he walked down the Bills in the second half. It was just an unfortunate drop from Mark Andrews. Still, when the contained scheme is disciplined and the windows in the pocket get tighter, Lamar hasn't been able to operate the way the moment demands. But I may be biased, I still think he gets one. The thing about Josh Allen is that he's pretty much different from almost everybody else on this list. He did the work to improve his accuracy like Lamar. He came into the league completing 53% of his passes and has dramatically improved since then. He was raw in a way that made scouts nervous about whether his talent would actually ever translate to wins. By 2020, he had completely rebuilt his footwork and tightened up his release, which turned the Bills into a legitimate Super Bowl contender. That development arc is one of the most impressive things we've seen in recent NFL history. So we have to ask why January keeps eating him alive. The problem is that improving your mechanics during your regular season is one thing, but overriding a deeply wired instinct under playoff pressure is something else entirely. Allen definitely learned how to play the position better, but he never fully unlearned the belief that he can win any game through sheer force of will. That belief was probably true for him in high school and at Wyoming, and it's true enough in the regular season to win him an MVP, but it runs directly into a wall that January builds. The 2026 divisional game against the Broncos is a perfect example of this. Josh finished that game with 4 turnovers, and even though he threw for 283 yards and ran for 66 more, the talent on the stat sheet didn't matter. The fumble he had right before halftime tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. The Bills were nowhere near field goal range and the half was ending, so any quarterback who has killed the hero ball instinct just takes a knee and goes into the locker room. Instead, Josh tried to manufacture a huge play. The ball came out and Denver scored on the very next possession. Buffalo went into half down 10 points that they didn't have to be, and that single decision is the residue of 20 years of learning that he can fix any problem himself. The 2024 AFC Championship game against Kansas City is just a different version of that exact same story. The Bills went 3 and out repeatedly in the second half when they needed to methodically move the chains and control the clock. Allen felt the weight of the game and kept reaching for a massive play that wasn't there instead of taking what the defense was giving him. They didn't turn it over like the very next playoffs, but going 4 and out in the final possession as the reigning MVP wasn't ideal. The gifts he has are what convinces him at the worst possible moments that he has to be the answer to every single problem. Elite playoff defenses in January have one job, and that's to make you prove you can win without the heroics. So has anyone actually broken out of this trap? The answer is one player, but the specific things that had to happen for him to succeed actually tell you more about the problem than the solution. Steve Young ran a 4.49 40, which meant he was faster than most defensive backs playing in that era. He rushed for over 400 yards in several different seasons as a starter, and for a quarterback in the 80s and 90s, that was basically unheard of. The thing is, Young had one advantage that other guys we've spoken about never got. He had Bill Walsh deciding his running ability was the very last thing they were going to work on. Walsh ran the West Coast offense, and that system is built entirely on timing, footwork, and how fast you can process information before the snap. It relies on short routes delivered on a specific rhythm before the receiver even makes his break. In this system, pocket presence isn't just a bonus, it's the entire system. You can't just scramble your way through these plays because the ball has to be out on a specific count or the whole structure falls apart. Bill didn't change the offense to fit what Young could do with his legs, but instead, he forced Young to master the mental side of the game. Steve also sat behind Joe Montana for years and just absorbed that system without the pressure of having to start right away. By the time he finally took over the full-time job, he wasn't starting from zero on his pocket mechanics. His career completion percentage of 64% was no accident, and neither was the fact that he retired with the highest passer rating in NFL history. Even with all that coaching, look at what else had to be in place for him to win. He had Jerry Rice on the outside in one of the greatest offensive schemes ever designed. The franchise was already a winning machine with a championship culture left over from the Montana years. This one exception to the rule required a Hall of Fame coach, the greatest receiver ever, and years of development that no other freak athlete on this list has ever received. Jalen Hurts and Russell Wilson have tried to follow a similar path with how Steve developed his processing and his game, but neither are the athlete Young was at his peak. Jalen started as a pure runner at Alabama, moved to Oklahoma to grow his passing game, and then landed in Philadelphia where the system pushed him toward pocket efficiency. Rush started at NC State, then had to go to Wisconsin, finally earning his way to starting as a rookie. They both made it to the big stage twice and got one ring, but even Jalen and Russ don't get away from the critics. A huge part of their fan bases still argue about how much of that success was themselves versus the talent around them. That debate never really stops for players who were first defined by their legs, no matter what they actually do on the field. The freak athlete label sticks to you, and it follows you all the way into January and the remainder of your career until retirement. So there you have it. Subscribe if you're new and watch this next video if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.